A home. It's something we all need. But for too many, having a safe place to make a home is out of reach. The challenges can seem insurmountable. And yet, each and every day, people are coming together to provide safe, quality, and affordable housing for those in need. Welcome to Let's Talk Housing. I'm your host, Mita Naidu. Join us as we listen to and learn from people in British Columbia who are creating strong, inclusive communities where everyone can thrive. Welcome to Let's Talk Housing. I'm your host, Mita Naidu. I want to begin by acknowledging and thanking the Coast Salish peoples on whose unceded and traditional lands I live and work. In particular, I offer my gratitude to the Kikut First Nations on whose unceded lands I reside and am recording today. Today, we are talking about BC Builds, a groundbreaking initiative that's tackling the housing crisis in British Columbia by using underutilized land and strategic partnerships to accelerate rental housing development for middle-income earners. Joining us today are Lisa Helps, who is the executive lead of Project Origination and Process Innovation at BC Builds, and Amal Abdullah, who is the project coordinator for value-added housing and renewable cities at SFU. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mita.
Before we dive into the details, though, I'd love to hear a little bit about what drew you, both of you, to the work you're doing in housing. Why is this issue personally important to you? Can I start with you, Lisa?
Sure. It really does come out of my work as Mayor of Victoria, which was my previous role. And I saw firsthand the challenges of getting housing built from a municipal perspective, and also the impacts from a middle income perspective, the impacts to our small business community, to employers, to our hospitals, that people who earn a half decent salary were still not able to find a place to live in Victoria, where I was mayor, but also across the province. And I feel the work that we're doing at BC Builds really excites me because it's tangible. It creates housing, which is obviously our mandate, but it also adds to stronger communities, more cohesive workplaces, more opportunities for families. So I feel like it's kind of, even though the focus is on housing, it's a whole community building and economic development approach to some of the crisis that we're facing across the province and the country right now.
So it's really born out of your role as mayor and wanting to see a holistic approach to housing and community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I come at almost everything from a systems point of view. When we're working on one thing, we should actually be working on 7 if we're doing a good job. 7 might be a bit of an exaggeration, but we should always, I think, be multi-solving. Right. Especially when we've got so many intersecting crises. And that's what really excites me about the work that we get to do here.
Amazing. Thank you. And what about you, Amal? What drew you to housing?
Yeah, a little bit of the same, actually, like thinking about housing as part of this complex and interconnected system that's, like impacting so many parts of people's lives. And so like I have a planning background, so I'm always thinking about like how housing affects, like transportation, and how housing affects food systems and things like that. And so when we think about housing in a housing crisis, it's not just, about like having a roof over your head. It's also about, like what access you have to food and what modes of transportation you use, and, like how connected you feel to your neighbors and how safe you feel in the event of an emergency, especially climate emergency. And so like thinking about housing as a system and not just like a shelter or like a roof over someone's head is what gets me excited.
It's very interesting to hear you talk about planning. My late father was a city planner and engineer, and he also thought about housing in a very holistic and integrated way. Religious institutions, grocery stores, walkable cities. These were all things he was thinking about in the 70s and 80s as well. So yeah, this is something I'm really interested in as well. Let's talk about BC Builds a bit. It's been called a game changer in housing. So Lisa, I'd like to open up the conversation by asking if you could break down for our audience who may not necessarily know much about housing and development, what makes BC Builds different from traditional housing programs?
That's a great question. One of the things that makes it different, and one of the things that makes me quite excited to continue to work on this program, in the typical development timeline, it usually takes 3 to 5 years from the point at which a landowner says, "Hey, I've got land and I want to build housing here," to the time that actually shovels are in the ground and construction starts. 3 to 5 years, never mind the 2 to 3 years that it actually takes to build the building to people living in their home. So if, from I've got land to people living in a home, it's about an 8-year process. And that is way too long. It just is, for all of the reasons that we talked about in our personal introductions. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. We can't take that long. And so what BC Builds does, we are also looking towards innovative construction methods to try and shorten the construction time, and that will come. But what we do right now is we look at the pre-development process, and rather than working one step at a time, so first there's the land, and then you develop the partnerships, then you go see the city and say, okay, what's the zoning? And then you start on the zoning approvals, and then maybe you find financing, and then finally you've got construction. And you're doing all of those things sequentially. What we do with BC Builds, and if anyone wants to go to our website, you can see our beautiful rocket ship. It's also in the case study that Amal wrote up. We put everything in right at the beginning. So we're working on partnerships, we're working on feasibility, we're working on financial approvals, we're working on zoning approvals, we're working at, sometimes the contractor comes in very early on. And so we put everything together kind of in this, we call it our little rocket ship model. Everything comes in at the beginning. We create a project acceleration committee. And what really is exciting about that is that everybody knows everybody else's part. Because when you're working in that linear way, no one can see what everyone else is doing. And that's one of the reasons it takes long. But if the architect understands what the planner needs and the planner understands what the financing person needs, it really accelerates housing, the pre-development period. So the program's been around for a year, and we've been able to successfully compress that 3 to 5 year timeline into 12 months in some cases to get we have about probably 5 or 6 projects. I was just looking at this today, already under construction, and our program just launched a year ago.
That's amazing. That's a super acceleration, in my opinion. Tell me more about this committee at the front end.
We started off calling them project steering committee meetings, but then actually, as just very recently, my New Year's resolution is like, wait a minute, these aren't steering projects, these are accelerating projects. So we call them project acceleration committees. And it's kind of like a good analogy for folks that also helps me. It's kind of like a tech accelerator, right? Like if somebody has a new idea for software or a new tech product, they want to get to minimum viable product as soon as possible so that they can see, does this thing actually have merit in the market or not? Am I going to make money? Is my solution useful? And so everyone rallies around that problem to try and figure out how to unpack it and get it to what's called in the tech world minimum viable product as soon as possible. We're not trying to get to minimum viable product. We're trying to get to construction, but it's the same methodology. So we've got everybody there at these project acceleration committee meetings, and Amal attended as a guest to work on her case study. So she might want to add in here as well. But you've got sometimes the mayor in smaller places, the mayor wants to be involved, but somebody senior in the planning department, sometimes the city manager, sometimes the architect will be there. Then there are us as the folks who are doing financing. Often they'll have a development consultant involved to help steward the process from the landowner's point of view. If we're working with CMHC, we have them there. And really, the best way to describe it is an obstacle removal clearinghouse. So rather than, someone sending an email, someone replying 3 weeks later because they've got 17 other emails, everything gets triaged in this project acceleration committee meeting. There's a project tracker, there are action items, they get handed out at the end of the meeting. And then 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, we circle back, okay, what action have you taken? And what are you going to do in the next 2 or 3 weeks? So it's really kind of momentum building. It's also really joyful. It's a very joyful way to work.
I actually love that you just added that in. Tell me more. Where is that joy coming from?
I think it's from the satisfaction of seeing how it's possible to do things differently. Because a lot of these folks, they've been working in planning departments, they've been working in the development community. There's in some cases for 20 years, and it's just like, oh my goodness, we're doing something together, and it's new, and I think there's some joy there, but also just the satisfaction of. And there's some wicked problems. I actually think no wonder we're in a housing crisis. It is so difficult to get housing built. Like even with a whole lot of people who know what they're doing. And so I think there's also joy that comes from, wow, this is like at the beginning of a meeting, like here's a really big problem. How are we ever going to figure this out? And then 45 minutes later, with everyone's brain power together, we've worked through it and that obstacle no longer exists and we can proceed. I think there's some joy in that satisfaction as well.
That's amazing. That's probably the first time I've heard someone talk about housing programs and joy in the same sentence. I love it. I love it. Amal, what about you? You and your team at SFU Renewable Cities have written a case study, as Lisa was alluding to, about the BC Builds program. Can you talk about that and your process of putting it together and who it's for?
So my role is at SFU Renewable Cities. We're a special initiative of SFU Centre for Dialogue. And this case study that we put together on BC Builds is a part of our value-added housing initiative. And at Renewable Cities, we think of value-added housing as housing developments that bring together affordability, climate action, and economic transition. And we've done a little bit of work on this before we started working with Lisa on the case study, in that we released some other case studies last year of nonprofit and public groups who had, prior to the BC Builds program, put together housing on their land for their communities. And since then, we've also hosted several workshops with some of these groups who are interested in exploring building housing on this land. So when BC Builds was launched in February 2024, we heard that there was a lot of interest from groups about what BC Builds was. And there were questions like, okay, well, BC Builds is a new program, and how is it different from other housing programs that the province or BC Housing have launched previously? And we also heard that there was a lot of interest across the country about, like replicating the program. And this interest particularly increased, we heard, after the federal government announced some funding around Canada Builds, which was intended to sort of like help create BC Builds like programs across the country. And so our team at Renewable Cities was already doing some of this work with Lisa and some of our other partners on like non-traditional housing developers building housing on underutilized lands. And so when BC Builds launched, we found that the program was actually addressing some of the challenges that we had identified in the case studies that groups were experiencing when they had built housing on their lands. And we also found that, like some of the pieces of the program were quite impactful and like really important for other jurisdictions in Canada to learn about and for the housing sector here in BC to learn about too. And so we decided to do a deep dive into the BC Builds program. And so the case study is really like a review of the entire program, starting from even before it was launched. And we put it together primarily for provincial, regional, local, and First Nations governments to understand the program and to replicate it. But we're also hoping that the learnings that are coming from BC Builds that we've documented in the case study can be replicated to other housing programs here in BC too. So to learn about, like the behind the scenes of BC Builds, I interviewed Lisa, I interviewed some of her colleagues at BC Housing and the BC Ministry of Housing and Municipal Affairs. And as Lisa said, I also dropped in on some of the project's acceleration meetings over a few months. And so I got to see how the program was actually like being implemented in action. In the case study, we sort of give like a complete overview of the programs. And so we talk about, like how do projects come into the BC Build program? What are the financial and legal arrangements often like? What are the agreements that BC Builds uses to disperse the funds to projects? Something else we highlight in the case study is, like what are all the steps that Lisa and her team took to put together the program? Like what was the engagement process like? Their process of like getting a sense of what lands are available for the program and those sorts of pieces. And we also highlight how BC Builds is different from other BC housing programs. And so Lisa mentioned the rocket ship and that accelerated timeline, and we highlight that, and also like, the partnership model and what that looks like.
That's a lot of work. That's amazing. From a Renewable Cities angle, Lisa's spoken about the benefits of the program from her perspective and her lens. From your perspective, what are the impacts of this program?
So when I was talking to Lisa and some of her colleagues, one thing that really stood out to me about BC Builds was like the very strong engagement process that went behind the program's design. And so Lisa will tell you, and she told me when we were talking about, when she first started in this role and started thinking about BC Builds, she tapped into some of those networks that she had built in her role as mayor and like talked to anybody who might potentially be involved in the program. And so I remember there were conversations with like First Nations groups, there were conversations with mayors and universities and health authorities, and really anyone else who might potentially be involved in the program. And she went and really listened to them and asked them and said, like, what do you need from a program like this? And I feel that that's very useful and impactful because, instead of just making a program, writing up a program and assuming that what you have in mind is going to work, you're actually going out into community and asking, what do you need from us to make this program useful for you? And I feel that, if you're in the long term, if you're evaluating the impact of a program, the outcomes will probably be stronger if you have that strong engagement process that went into the program's design. And, Lisa was also talking about how, it really clarified for the team too about what's important to advocate for, to include in the program, and what to sort of park for later and come back to because it's not as important to the community.
Deep listening and community engagement are something that I'm very passionate about too. And as I kind of, touched on the project in the very early stages, that's something I loved about it also, was the deep listening. And Lisa does do deep listening for sure. That's something I know about her as well. I'm going to just kind of veer into that area of community and community engagement. Housing development often meets resistance in community. We know this. So what were some of the particular ways that BC Builds engaged with communities to ensure projects are aligned with those local needs, either to you or to Lisa?
Sure, I'll jump in. One of the ways that we can accelerate is that we rely on our partners to get the zoning in place almost always before we get engaged, sometimes not. And so most of our partners that have come through our Housing Development Opportunities platform, which if people want to Google, they should. There's some really interesting work happening there. But the municipalities do the work of working with their communities. They know their communities best. They get the land zoned and then bring it to us. And so that kind of table has been set. In other cases, we are working on a few large complex projects where zoning is not yet in place. And it is really important to, particularly when it comes to zoning or an official community plan amendment, to make sure the community feels engaged and informed. And also, and again, I can say this because I sat at a municipal council table for 11 years, 8 years as mayor. It's also important when the decision comes to council for them to make that they have, whichever council it might be across the province, the courage to look 50 years down the road and say, that yes, there are 10 or 20 or 50 people who are here tonight who are unhappy with this housing being built, but the 300 people who are going to benefit from it that are going to move in when this building opens, and then multiply that out 50 or 60 or 70 years. It does take political courage to make those decisions when the time comes. But we try with our partners to do a really good job of informing neighbors, holding info sessions, sending mailers out, all of those things to make sure that, we're never going to get everyone to agree, but at least that people feel informed and that they've had an opportunity to give their input. And most of our work isn't that. Most of our work is working with pre-zoned land where the municipalities, our partners, have done the hard work in the first place, which I think it would be great to talk a little bit about our partners and partnerships, because that's really the secret sauce of the program.
For sure. And I definitely want to get into that. And this kind of segues into that. But what role do municipalities and First Nations play in shaping these projects?
Well, they are their projects. And that's where, to Amal's point, when we went out across the province and asked everyone who we thought we might be interested, what do you need this program to do? One of the key things we heard from First Nations, from municipalities, from health authorities, from boards of education, is we have land, we have a housing need. We know our community needs housing, but we are not housing developers. We don't have the capacity to develop housing because we're doing X, Y, Z other thing for our nation or our community or our school district. And so what we need is a program that will give us the capacity or provide the capacity to us to actually turn our vacant land into new housing for our community. And so that we heard loud and clear that is what was needed. And so we really built the program around those needs. And so First Nations, municipalities, churches, those are our three main partners right now. We were doing some preliminary work with health authorities and some exploratory conversations with school districts. Their role is providing the land and then really they're the muscle in some ways behind this project acceleration work, and the project acceleration committees. They need to commit, they need to show up, and they need to work to remove every obstacle that comes up. And they're doing it. Like, it's amazing. We've been working with small Indigenous communities in the north, large cities in Metro Vancouver, and everybody in between. And all of the landowners show up with that same can-do approach that they've put their land in, and now they want to get housing built quickly. And we, the BC Builds team, kind of put some of that capacity around their desire.
Right. That's amazing. It's very participatory. It's very proactive in that way, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we're talking about municipalities, landowners, nonprofits, faith groups, First Nations. Amal, maybe you could talk about how this everyone at the table model contributes to better projects.
So I sat in on some of these project acceleration meetings where everyone was at the table, and this was a little bit earlier when BC Builds was new and none of the projects had yet come to the construction phase. And I remember Lisa telling me, well, if you want to understand BC Builds, you have to see it. Like, you have to see it in action. You can't just hear me talk about it or, read the website that we have. You need to really see what groups are experiencing when they go through the program. And so I sat in on these meetings sort of like as a fly on the wall, and I was just observing and taking notes on what was happening. And in that process, I was really able to see how, like, in real time, these groups were able to come together. All the different partners in a development project were able to come together and problem solve on issues in real time that came up in the project. And we list some of the examples of what that looked like in the case study. But as an example, one project that I was sitting in on was a meeting where the architect was presenting two different designs of a building, and all the different partners in the project were at that meeting together. And, there was the landowner, there was the city planner, Lisa and her team were there. And so everyone was just sort of like talking through the design and saying, for example, the landowner was like, okay, well, what if we move the community kitchen to like a more central space so other users in the building can use it? And the city planner was like, okay, well, what if we, add a few parking spots here or remove them from here? Or what if we play around with that a little bit? And everyone was bringing the pieces that they needed from the project at the same time at this meeting together. And just sort of like talking through it. And of course, like anyone who's familiar with the development process knows that, not having that space is one of the things that can really make a project timeline so much longer. And, everyone was just bringing in the pieces that they needed and problem solving together. There's a section in the case study, in fact, where, I asked all the groups that I sat in on, I asked them, what are you finding useful about the space? And people talked about all the ways that it made, their job so much easier. Just like quick check-ins over consistently over the period of timeline just made their job so much easier. And also it helped build trust between the different groups, right? Because even if groups weren't able to necessarily find the solution that they were looking for in the project, just having that space to problem solve was able to help build them trust with one another.
Another amazing word that's popped up in this conversation is trust, right? So I love that also. Lisa, Amal's been talking about the benefits of the pieces of the process to partners. Can you walk us through an actual real-world example of a BC Builds project, kind of from land identification to groundbreaking, for someone that's unfamiliar but would want to bring forward a project?
There are two separate ways. So maybe I'll talk about, why don't I just lay out the two pathways in for public stream projects, and then I'm going to give an example of one of our projects kind of from start to groundbreaking. So the two ways that projects can come in is just simply approach BC Builds and say, hey, we've got land, or we would like to build housing for middle income households and families. And in some cases, the landowner will already have a development partner. And in some cases, so that's pathway one. You've got land, you've got a development partner, and then we start to work through your project pro forma. How does this work? For what rents will you need to charge? How are you going to cover the mortgage, et cetera, et cetera? What are your construction costs? So that's pathway one. Partner comes with a development partner and they're ready to go. Pathway 2 is you've got land and it's zoned and you'd like to hand it over to BC Builds to find you a development partner. Or in some cases, you've got land and it's zoned and you may have a nonprofit that you have in mind to own and operate the housing, but you don't have anyone to build it. So those are the two pathways. One is the direct intake and the other is through our Housing Development Opportunities platform. And again, for people who are interested in that, Google it. It's quite innovative in that, we kind of act as a bit of a broker. For people who are interested in that pathway, I'd encourage them to go look at the site, look at the property opportunity notices that are posted. You can see how it works, what municipalities or landowners need to tell us, what kinds of questions the development community is asking. So that is one pathway. And I would say probably about half our projects have come in that way. The project that I'm going to focus on to walk through it came in through the first pathway. So City of North Vancouver came to us early on, even before I was working at BC Builds. And I guess just for transparency, I was the Mayor of Victoria. And then for a year, I was the Housing Solutions Advisor to Premier Eby with the task of setting up BC Builds. So before I got to BC Builds, I was in the Premier's office, and that's where all this engagement and everything else that Amal was talking about happened. And so through that engagement process, out in the community across the province, asking generally, what do you need the program to do? And then people started saying, well, when's it starting? I've got land. And so City of North Vancouver was one of the first ones through the door. They have an old one-story neighborhood house that delivers amazing programs to their community. The building was built, I think, in the 60s at end of life. And they weren't planning in their city capital plan to build a new neighborhood house until 2028. But they did have some land. And so they said, well, wait a minute, can we put a new neighborhood house underneath and can we put housing on top? And so we started having those conversations probably, I think, like very early, kind of summer of 2023, just like at the idea stage. And then by December of 2023, the City Council had engaged Catalyst as their development partner, they were working on another project with, so they had that relationship. And then we got involved. I think the Project Acceleration Committee meetings began in January of 2024. And then we walked through it. The land was zoned already, but it's a mass timber building, so it's very complex, 18 stories with 3 stories of community space on the first 3 floors and 15 stories of housing on top. So the design process happened. The project was led by the city's deputy city manager and the head finance guy and some folks from the planning department. And that project worked, like all of the kudos for that project go to the staff at the City of North Vancouver and the folks at Catalyst Developments. And this one was a bi-weekly Project Acceleration Committee meeting because it was such a complex project, so many players. The city had to go in the middle of the process and go to the public and ask to borrow $50 million for their portion. And the public thankfully said yes. And now it's February of 2025. We started in January of 2024, and they are under construction. Like that project started construction a couple of weeks ago. And it's just that's kind of a walkthrough every 2 weeks for a whole year. It seems like so much time, but when you it actually, like that project would usually take 3 to 5 years just to get to construction.
Wow, that's amazing. That's truly amazing.
Yeah.
Through even the public consultation process, this was still within a year.
Well, the land was already zoned. So
Right,
that's key. Like that is really key. So the public consultation process had happened some time ago whenever the city took the proactive step to zone the land. But the public, there was definitely that added step of convincing the public
Right.
that $50 million was a good idea to spend. So yeah,
Right.
that's true. There was that public consultation on the money side for the city.
Right. Amazing. Amazing. So collaboration, courage, joy, speed,
And trust.
and trust, right? Like amazing components to an exceptionally unique program. How do you see this kind of program influencing the future of housing development, Lisa, in Canada?
I never want to be too raw BC Builds. And so Barb from the City of North Vancouver, we actually held a session at, I believe it was the Housing Central Conference, where we invited one of our private partners, one of our public partners, and one of our nonprofit partners. So 3 different groups, and asked them to talk about, all the things that we're talking about here, but also what are some of the challenges, because it can't all be as good as we're talking about. So I will answer your question, but some of the challenges are that it really does require staff at the municipality or the First Nation to prioritize the project, which means that they are deprioritizing other things. So that can be challenging. It requires people to stretch out of their comfort zones and out of their regular line of work sometimes. So that can also be a challenge. And then just the pace, like going at that pace. We've really tried hard not to miss things, but sometimes, we're moving so quickly. And this is why the case study that Amal did was so useful. We're moving so quickly. What are the things that we would have done differently had we taken more time? And then learning on that project can go to the next project and say, okay, wait, even though we're moving quickly, we need to do this thing. So there's some learnings that can come, but I think those are some of the challenges. In terms of how this has the potential to impact the way that housing is built, we did a survey of our partners. And actually, I don't even think I've shared this with them all. So we did a survey of all of our public stream partners at the end of year 1 and asked them what worked, what didn't work, what can we do better, what's useful, and what will you take from BC Builds to inform other parts of your work or other parts of housing development. And so I think part of what BC Builds can offer, and I'm again, Amal's work is so important for the scaling up and the transformational piece, is that it is actually possible to compress that pre-development timeline. It is actually possible to get housing built faster. It is that, and so one of the key things that people said they would take from their work with BC Builds to other projects in their municipalities or First Nations or in the private sector are these project acceleration committee meetings. Like, that is a key tool that has the potential to be transformational. So I do think it's possible for BC Builds to have an influence just beyond our program by everyone reading Amal's case study and seeing how the work happens, but B, using some of the tools that we've created for our purpose and translating them to other purposes for both housing projects and other kinds of community projects or development projects as well.
These intersections are critical. That's, I think, the proof is here that these intersections and collaborations are critical. What advice, Lisa, would you give other provinces or cities trying to replicate this?
Amal and the SFU folks, their case study is really good. Like, they did a really good job. I think they asked us the right questions. They asked the province the right questions. They pointed out some of the challenges. They pointed out some of the things that we did well before we started and the things that probably we could have done better. So yeah, I guess the advice that I would give is it is possible. We are living proof. And that no crisis is going to be resolved without a different way of working together. We're in a housing crisis because we've been building housing in the same way for the last 100 years, both on the pre-development side and the construction side. So if we keep doing the same things, we're not going to fast track. And then, just the collaboration and the trust and the joy are just really, it's a new way of working together that actually feels good. And, work is hard and building things is hard. It's really, really hard. And so creating these committees, these project acceleration committees, where people have a shared purpose, they have a shared goal, they have a shared timeline. It is very motivating. So this is actually kind of interesting. There's no shortcuts to a project acceleration committee. Like, you have to show up, you have to collaborate, you have to be willing to change your position. If somebody in the group has a better idea, you have to be willing to problem solve. That's some of the advice that I would give. It's hard work. Like, it is not easy.
Right. It sounds extremely complicated, but extremely rewarding.
Yeah.
And that's the gift. Before we wrap up, Amal, you've talked about the work around BC Builds, but what are some of the other projects that Renewable Cities is working on around housing?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So the goal of our work at Renewable Cities isn't just to build more housing for its own sake, but to really create excellent housing that serves people's needs to be connected to their communities and also live within the planet's limits. And so the BC Builds case study is one way that we're thinking about excellent housing. And we're also thinking about social connectedness and climate resilience in housing design. So another initiative that we're working on in collaboration with Hey Neighbor Collective and Happy Cities is called Housing That Connects Us. And I'll give you an example of what we're doing there. But the critical question that we're asking about in that initiative is, how do we transform our existing housing spaces to better serve the needs of the residents who live there? So if you take the example of a 3-story walk-up apartment building, for example, they're often older, but they have more affordable rental stock. And they often also have like a very large setback or a lawn that surrounds them that has grass, but it's not very engaging or used very often by the residents. And in cases like those, we're asking questions like, well, what could happen if we created a garden space that offers a chance for residents to meet each other there? And what if there's also a rain garden in there for managing stormwater on the property? Can we do something like, creating a little seating nook in a corridor so that residents have like a little space to gather and have conversations and get to know each other better? And how does that help them get to know their neighbors and check in the next time an extreme heat event rolls around, for example? So what we're really asking is, what are all the different ways that we can make our housing design more socially connected and climate resilient to create those connections and make housing really excellent for everyone? And that's something we'll be exploring over the next few months in that initiative.
Amazing. This is a beautiful connection point between BC Builds and SFU, but also between Lisa and you, Amal. I think this is a really cool relationship. Thank you both for this really insightful conversation. And listeners, if you want to learn more, check out BC Build's website and Amal's case study on the website. Is it on the website right now, Amal?
It's on the SFU Renewable Cities website.
Okay. Oh, but we should put it on our website. What is wrong with us? Okay.
That's exactly that just came to mind right now for me too.
We've got to get it on our website. And actually, we can help with that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, action item. I'll write to Allie right away and get it up there.
Exactly. And as always, stay curious and stay engaged, and see you next time. To learn more about BC Housing, including how to apply for subsidized housing in British Columbia, visit www.bchousing.org. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and X. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a rating. This will help others find Let's Talk Housing and join the conversation. You can subscribe to Let's Talk Housing on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.